You know, the thing about MSQ roulette duties for me is not so much that they're somewhat long and tedious, but rather that it seems like there is a much higher probability of someone playing their job in the weirdest ways. And often, it's not a case of a sprout, which just makes it even weirder. Anyway, welcome back to the Mentor Roulette grind. This time, the Wheel of Jobs somehow decided to replay Gunbreaker on a Monday evening, despite there being nearly 80% chance for another DPS. This set was somewhat varied, but emphasized in the weirdest way. Speaking of which, for Duty 1, we went to Praetorium, and at least for the first half of the duty, there was something with our healer. Let me explain. Before the first boss, I saw them use Holy a grand total of once. Including the first boss, I also saw them use Medica 2 completely at random, including at times where everyone were already at full HP and had the HOT already. This, I would say, is a common indication that they don't recognize their attacks as relevant, so lacking anything better to do, they can just maintain their HOT. It also seemed like they were very quick to throw out Benediction out of nowhere. As such, I asked if I could give them some advice. But after a moment of quiet, the Red Mage responded instead, saying they would like to know. Both players had similar language settings, so it is possible the Red Mage was ready to pass the information to the White Mage. So, as they asked for the information, not to be rude, I decided to explain it more generally. Don't use Medica 2 if everyone is full anyway, and if healing isn't needed. Use attacks like Stone for one enemy, Holy for more. Indeed, the White Mage did start attacking a bit on Nero and onward after that, which I will already consider success. They even attacked at times where we were not topped up. Once you start knowing you can attack as a healer and it is okay, the ball is moving and we're going somewhere. Another little detail I want to add is that I noted that both the Red and White Mages did not have their games set to English, so I suspected that maybe they would have found it difficult to follow if I got too wordy with my explanations. Which is why the way I worded it might sound a bit borked. So I just want to highlight an additional way to help each other give advice in an indirect way. Let's say I had asked the White Mage if I could give them advice, and no one had said anything. Then me just moving on to explaining it anyway is like ignoring whether they want the advice or not. Usually I only give it if they say yes. But by the Red Mage asking for the information, I can ignore whether the White Mage wants the advice or not, and focus on pointing out how the Red Mage perhaps could improve compared to what we're seeing the White Mage do. This also enables the White Mage to choose whether they will take the advice or not. They didn't personally say yes please, so if they don't care, they can simply continue to not care. So, the advice here is if you see another fellow player asking if they can give advice and it seems to fall on deaf ears, you could try offering for them to explain it to you. Even if you don't need the advice, you might already know the answer anyway. But it opens the door for a way to discuss the subject without the, you could say, target player necessarily feeling like they're being talked at. I have a whole separate video talking about ways to politely offer advice if you're interested. Link in the description. For Duty 2, we went to Tower of Zod, and oh look, Milo from my raid team apparently sniped me. I think Rot also knew me. Hello. Given that we have a very solid team, not that much special happens throughout the duty, but on the final AoE pull before the final boss, which is always a challenge, gets quite exciting. I use every single cooldown I have, but as I had already used Nebula for the previous pull and Super Bolide was used on a pack before the second boss, I'm slightly limited. In a situation like this, it is important to stay calm and focused. Just because you drop to near death, don't use everything if the fight isn't close to over, otherwise you're just delaying death. Focus on cycling your buffs and trust the healers ready with their part. Throughout this pull, I both step away from the pack to delay auto attacks for a second, use Arm's Length and even Heart of Light, since it reduces physical damage now too. As I close in on death, I adjust the amount of cooldowns I aim to have running at a time to try and make sure I make them last as long as possible. By the end of the pull, every defensive option I have is on cooldown, including my single target stun. Although, had it continued for a bit longer, Super Bolide would finally be ready. On the final boss, usually when Sindaruva goes down, most teams I've been with deal with Sandaruva second, but in this one we end up dealing with Mindaruva second. Both paths make sense. Mindaruva has, to my knowledge, the least HP, so she goes down faster. However, if Zandaruva is done third, it is very likely she will get her Manusha Confuse off, which will be more inconvenient to deal with. Also, fun fact, you can attack the other sisters before Zandaruva goes down. Just keep in mind that if they die, she will raise them to half HP again. I don't know if she will heal them beyond this, but she will raise them. For duty 3, we are a 20-minute replacement in Garuda Extreme. Lunar explains that everyone already knows how the fight goes, so I offer to go off tank since that is kind of the slightly more complicated spot. I double check which boss I have to pick up and Mr. Elf does the main tanking. We get it done on the first try. A thing I hadn't considered before until progging Uwu is that Slipstream is something you could just dodge as a tank. For duty 4, we go to Urth's Fount, Odin, and Mr. Elf is also here. I notice I have significantly more HP due to my food buff, so I elect to main tank, mainly because of how insane Odin's tank busters are. Each time Zangetile comes up, I use the biggest defensive I have, starting with Nebula, then Rampart, and then Camouflage and Reprisal. However, the tank buster comes up so many times that by the 4th time, I have to either take it raw or with Super Bolide, and I hope it doesn't kill me outright and take it raw, and as Gunbreaker, it's not like the damage difference would really be that big. Aside from this, the run goes nice and easy. For duty 5, we went to Great Gubal Library hard, which is a pretty interesting duty, especially the final boss. It puts out various fields, some of which have temporary detrimental effects for standing in them, but also protects you from the owl's attacks if you use the right effect. Notably, at the start, 4 levitation fields appear, which are used to avoid the damage from Quake. After that, 2 pairs of fields appear, one which gives you leaden, slowing you down, and the other turning you into an imp. Then the owl uses darkness, which requires no response. It's just a raid wide, hoping to bait you to run into the imp circle or something. Then the tornado spell requires you to stand in the leaden field. And when you are already an imp, stepping in the imp circle turns you back to normal, which is necessary shortly after. The owl also uses thunder, which is just spread markers. What I really like about this fight is that it gives you different possible answers, and the boss asks for one. But what makes this kind of mechanic particularly interesting is that there is a question with no answer. Darkness. To bait you to choose an answer that might be wrong, especially interesting right after having a question with only one possible answer which is always correct in Quake. This really makes the theme of the fight that much more interesting to me. For duty 6, we're back in Praetorium again. This time, our sage seems to be very interested in applying shields, but they're at least attacking, just not with Dyscrasia. I guess that's okay, not aiming for perfection here. What was much weirder was probably our Black Mage's rotation. Fire 3, Fire 3, Fire 3, Flare, Blizzard 3, Freeze, repeat. Sometimes Blizzard 3, Fire 3 spam, I guess, for movement. Now, I saw them make a reference about Contra in the chat, so I'd have to assume they spoke English, and also had chat somewhat visible, so when I finally noticed, I asked if I could give them some tips. Unfortunately, they never responded. Just to be clear, both the Sage and the Black Mage had level 90 weapons, so it is at least unlikely they were completely new to their jobs. I guess playing their jobs even more efficiently might not make that big of a dent on the clear time, but still, it is a bit surprising and weird. For duty 7, we went to Friendly Hangouts, and as a tank, not much to say here, just spam AoE on everything. Consider targeting the Gorbu so that your auto attacks go to that for maximum efficiency. If it starts to go low, you could swap to the other mobs, but genuinely, just spam AoE. For duty 8, we went to Mount Gulg, and turns out Osric knew me. Hello! This duty is somewhat famous for having some of the craziest gigapulls, so perhaps it is worth pointing out that Osric stated they were quite new to Sage, and they did level up to 80 during the duty, so that checks out. For the first gigapull, I pretty much led with Super Bolide, and then worked my way through every single defensive cooldown I have, gradually working my way down to keep the damage intake somewhat smooth. Part of the reason why it makes sense to lead with some of the bigger ones first in this context, or any big AoE pull context really, is that hopefully some of the mobs will be dead by the time we have to scale down to the weaker options, and that will lead to the damage staying somewhat steady as this happens. Since this gigapull is every pack up to the boss. It also means that I won't need any defensives for the next AoE pull, just the boss. And if the boss targets me with anything, Heart of Stone will typically be good enough. That way, by pulling everything, I can safely access my entire defensive arsenal without fear of missing something later. Naturally, the bosses aren't nearly as challenging as such an AoE pull, and the packs between boss 1 and 2 are also a lot more manageable. A quick tip for these wall mobs though, is that these cone AoEs they fire out are aimed at random players, so by standing closer to the boss like this, you can aim the cones out in a direction where they're irrelevant. Now, for the Gigapull just before the final boss, it is yet another long run to pick everything up, and I have my entire arsenal ready to go again. While the first Gigapull has a lot of tank damage and some untelegraphed tail swipes and such that can hit everyone randomly, this pull is particularly scary because some of the enemies will cast Punitive Light, which can be interrupted or even stunned, but in a blob of this many mobs, it is very easy to miss. Punitive Light is a raid wide. The pressure this attack adds by coming through causes me to jump straight to Super Bolide despite having other cooldowns running. However, we managed to make it through. These Gigapulls are somewhat challenging and do require both the tank and the healer to be ready to bring it, but can also require effort from the DPS to get the mobs down before the supports run out of cooldowns. Granted, back in Endwalker, I managed to do these Gigapulls as a lone warrior, but that also required a ton of kiting and still was very difficult. My point is that not every group landing in Mount Gulg may be strong enough to do this. For Duty 9, we went to the Fell Court of Troia, which has some particularly interesting mechanics on the second and third bosses. The second boss has this mechanic where she draws lines on the floor. The exact explosion patterns from these lines align with the circles on the floor. Knowing this, you can stand extremely close to the explosions and be fine, minimizing movement needed. The second time she uses a gaze mechanic, they're placed pairwise opposite to each other. What is really helpful to know about this is that if you place yourself so you can look straight between the two gaze sources and look straight through the middle of the arena, you can dodge the gaze mechanics without even phasing away. Quite nifty for damage optimization. The final boss, Scamoleone, has this mechanic called Rotten Rampage. What is relevant to note about this is that these AoEs, including the ones centered on the players, destroy the barricades at the edge of the arena, so positioning yourselves too carelessly could rot away all of the barricades. Indeed, getting tossed out into the goop isn't lethal, but it hurts a lot, and I have wiped as a result of this a long time ago. Aside from that, the boss is pretty manageable. As a melee, it may be beneficial to save a gap closer for his knockback. And as a caster, either a gap closer or a few instants may be handy, since you're stuck in a sliding animation for a surprisingly long time, which could be cancelled or just ignored with instants. Finally, for Duty 10, we went to Lunar Subterrane, which has some interesting details as well. The first AoE pulls in the dungeon, and to some degree most of the AoE pulls, have at least one or two particularly chonky mobs, which introduces two different conundrums. Most jobs have some amount of their AoE attack arsenal concentrate a larger part of the damage to the primary target. However, circle-shaped AoEs centered on a target center the point of damage at the center of said target. So really chonky boys can shove everyone else so far away that, while centering flare on the chonkiest enemy maximizes that value, the total radius of flare might be small enough that the other mobs just don't get hit. Worth considering. Meanwhile, jobs that center their AoE on themselves or similar can much more easily focus their damage on the chonky boys without missing out on the secondary targets, so optimize your damage for the team. Now, two final interesting details. On the second boss, take note of the pillars when it dashes around. You will get shoved 2 rows in the direction of the arrows when that mechanic resolves, and you have maybe half a second or so to micro-adjust if you find yourself in a bad spot. Note which pillars will fall and adjust accordingly. An interesting fun fact here is that the boss will perform this dash a total of 4 times, and, as I recall, has a dedicated tank buster with a unique animation that it typically only uses once all 4 sets of dashes are spent. Weird, right? The final boss, Durante, with his fortified blade, has this mechanic where he combines Forsaken Fount with Contrapassa. There's a consistent save spot based on the position of the orbs. The orbs are placed in a hexagonal grid with a center spot, meaning 7 possible positions. Most of the time, not always, 3 of the orbs will be side by side and 1 orb will be alone in a corner. That lone orb is the safe spot. Sometimes the orbs will instead be placed pairwise in opposing corners. In this case, the safe spot is the center. For whatever reason, that configuration seems a lot less common. It is quite funny when I get these sets where even the extremes feel rather easy to drive through, like the Garuda extreme that was ran through faster than a dungeon. Now, we finished this set at 576 on the achievement, and now there is an 87.5% chance of drawing another DPS, as we have only a single support left to get from the Wheel of Jobs. Wild. In regards to the Mount Gulg Gigapulse, my advice is always that if you are the tank, you're welcome to try and pull as much as you can get away with. However, in the case of Mount Gulg, if it leads to a wipe, check with the healer or even the whole group before you just run in and do it the same way again. It might just not work. And pulling a bit less but not wiping is faster in the long run. Now, that is all for this video. Thank you so much for watching. If you would like to support me and my channel more directly, you can become a member like these wonderful people here. You can also alternatively support me through Ko-Fi, link in the description. You can also support the channel by letting the YouTube algorithm know by liking the video, leaving a comment, subscribing, sharing, and hitting the bell to get notified when next I post a video. Fun fact, skill and spell speed obviously affect weapon skills and spells respectively. However, with abilities that do damage or healing over time, speed also affects that. But is it skill or spell speed? Well, if the dot is physical, it is skill speed. For instance, Bow Shock. If it is magic or healing, it is spell speed. Notably, abilities that heal once after a while, such as Heart of Corundum, are considered HOTS in this aspect. This does indeed mean Gunbreaker's Aurora and Heart of Corundum scales with spell speed. Weird, right? I have a video here where I go into more detail on the subject. However, don't start putting spell speed on your Gunbreakers. It's just not that helpful.